Ethan Callahan laid his wife to rest using nothing but his own 2 hands. The very next day, he returned to his work. Not because his heart wasn't shattered into pieces, but because shattered men living in Wyoming territory couldn't afford the privilege of stopping. That happened 3 years back. Since then, he hadn't once uttered her name aloud. Then came a morning in summer when a woman appeared on his property with 2 starving children trailing behind her, dirt covering her boots, and she gazed at him the same way folks gaze at a door that's locked shut, hoping for something but not really believing anything would happen. He chose to open that door anyway, and doing so transformed everything. If this story touches something inside you, please hit that subscribe button on our channel and ring that notification bell. Fresh stories drop here every single week. Leave us a comment telling us which city you're watching from. I'm curious to see just how far this story can reach. The summer that arrived in 1876 came down hard and without mercy across Wyoming territory. The sort of heat that split the ground wide open, turned horses mean-tempered, and made men even worse than that. Red Hollow was nestled in a low basin sitting between 2 ridges, and come July, the entire town carried the smell of dust mixed with heated iron and something that felt sort of desperate, the way settlements smell when rainfall refuses to come but the bills never stop showing up. Ethan Callahan rode into that town on this particular morning the same way he rode in every single week, by himself, arriving early, finishing up before most men had gotten through their morning coffee. He secured his horse outside the general store, tugged his hat down low to shield against the sun, then walked inside. Walt Greer, the man who operated the store and maintained opinions about absolutely everything, was already running his mouth. Heard about a wagon that broke down out on the South Road, Walt mentioned without lifting his eyes from the ledger. He wasn't actually reading it. Woman traveling by herself. Got 2 children with her. That's so, Ethan responded. It wasn't framed as a question. He collected his list from the counter. She ain't from these parts? Been asking around about work? Plenty of folks asking about work this summer. Walt finally raised his eyes. This particular one has got no husband, no money, nothing except those 2 kids and a busted axle. Ethan placed his list back down on the counter. You should give her the Hendersons' vacant place to stay in. Walt blinked hard. Why in the world would I do something like that? Because nobody's using it, and the heat is brutal, and she's traveling with children. Walt gave a shrug like none of that was really his problem and returned his attention to his ledger. Ethan collected his supplies without speaking another word. He located her at the town's edge, standing next to a wagon that had lost its rear left wheel and was leaning sadly into the dirt like something embarrassed by its own condition. 2 children were perched on a trunk close by. A boy, possibly 10 years old, wearing the face of someone who'd figured out not to cry where people could see, and a girl no more than 6, who was chewing on her braid's end and observing everything with enormous brown eyes. The woman had her back facing him. She was speaking to the wheel as if she could convince it back onto the axle through pure determination. Her dress held what used to be a blue color but had been washed far too many times. Her hair was pinned up, though the heat had pulled it down in sections. Her hands, when she turned herself around, were the hands belonging to a woman who knew work. She looked directly at him. He returned her gaze. She was the first to speak. I'm not out here looking for any trouble, she stated. I just need somebody to point me toward a blacksmith who won't charge beyond what I've got. How much have you got? She didn't pause or hesitate. 40 cents. Ethan examined the wheel. Blacksmith's going to charge $2. She closed her eyes for just a brief moment, then opened them back up. Then I'll need to locate work first. What sort of work? Any sort at all. She met his eyes without looking away. Cooking, cleaning, mending things. I can manage livestock if that's required. I've operated a farm before. He studied her for a moment. Not in the way certain men study women, cataloging and making assessments, but rather the way a man examines a problem to understand its nature properly. You got a name? He asked. Clara Whitmore. These here are my children, Luke and Annie. The boy, Luke, straightened his posture when his name got mentioned, like someone had trained him to do that. The little girl, Annie, just continued chewing her braid and watching Ethan like she was attempting to determine whether he was safe. Ethan tipped his hat slightly. "Ethan Callahan, I run a ranch 6 miles north of here. You offering work, Mr. Callahan? I'm asking whether you want it." Clara looked at him, then shifted her gaze toward her children, then brought it back to him. What exactly would the work involve? Cooking, cleaning, helping maintain a kitchen garden. It's only me out on that land, and I eat terrible, and the place has the look of nobody caring about it because nobody actually does. He stated it without any decoration. No apology contained in it. I don't pay a whole lot, but you'd have a roof over your head and 3 meals every day, and your children would be kept safe. What are your expectations, Mr. Callahan? That you work hard and that you're honest with me. That's all? That's everything. Clara remained quiet for a long stretch. Luke tugged at her sleeve. "Mama," he said in a quiet voice. She placed her hand over his and examined Ethan one more time. "When would we be starting?" "Soon as I get your wheel fixed." He fixed it right there himself in the middle of the street while 3 men leaned themselves against the saloon's front and watched without offering any help. He could sense their eyes on him. He'd been sensing eyes exactly like that his entire adult life, that specific quality of attention a small town gives when it's determined something is interesting enough to pass judgment on. Walt Greer emerged from the store as Ethan was loading Clara's trunk into the back of his wagon. "You taking them out to your place?" Walt asked. "Yep," Ethan confirmed. Walt dropped his voice lower like that somehow made it less of what it actually was. "That ain't proper, Ethan. She needs work. I need help. That strikes me as proper enough. People are going to talk." Ethan climbed up onto the wagon seat. "People already talk, Walt, about everything and everybody. Haven't noticed it changing much of anything." He clicked his tongue at the horse. The wagon started moving. Behind him, he heard Walt say something directed at the men standing outside the saloon. Heard them laugh in response. He didn't turn to look back. The ranch occupied a long slope of land with a creek cutting through the south end and a view of the mountains that on mornings with clear skies made you believe the world was still mostly good. Ethan's wife, Rose, had loved that particular view. She'd built the kitchen garden and the herb bed positioned by the back door, and she'd hung curtains in every single window, even though Ethan had told her the horses didn't care one bit about curtains. After she passed, the curtains came down. The garden surrendered to weeds. The house acquired a quiet that had nothing whatsoever to do with sound. Ethan worked. He always worked. But the house remained empty in a way that working couldn't repair. When Clara stepped through that front door during the afternoon and stopped, looking around at the bare walls and the dusty windows and the table that held only a coffee tin and a broken harness, she didn't speak for a moment. Then she said, "Where do you keep your broom?" Ethan pointed toward it. She nodded a single time, rolled up her sleeves, and went to work. Annie discovered the cat before supper. It lived in the barn and possessed no name and maintained deep suspicion toward human beings. But Annie sat herself down in the straw and held perfectly still and waited with patience. And eventually, the cat approached her, because animals and children understand things about each other that adults have forgotten. Luke helped Ethan with the horses. He worked quietly, efficiently, with the concentrated focus belonging to a child who'd been required to be useful far too young. "You know horses?" Ethan asked. "Some," Luke responded. "My father had 2 of them." Ethan waited without pushing. "He died," Luke stated. "Fever, 2 winters back." "I'm sorry to hear that." Luke gave a shrug. That tight, small shrug, that means I've already made my peace with it because I didn't get offered a choice. Mama's been working since then. We were in Cheyenne, laundry work. He paused briefly. She was hoping for something better than that. Ethan handed him a brush. "Start on the gray horse." They worked in silence for a stretch, which was its own form of conversation. Clara cooked that night using what Ethan kept in his kitchen, which wasn't a whole lot. Dried beans, salt, pork, a sack of cornmeal, onions from last year that were still holding themselves together. She made something out of it that smelled like an actual proper meal, which was more than Ethan had managed in longer than he wanted to acknowledge. They sat at the table, all four of them together. For the first time in 3 years, Ethan had sat at that table with anyone at all. Annie talked. She possessed the unstoppable conversation of a 6-year-old who'd been told too often to be quiet and had stored up a tremendous amount of content in reserve. "The cat's name is Button," she announced with authority. "Cat doesn't have a name," Ethan said. "It does now." Clara looked at her daughter with the expression of a woman who'd given up fighting certain battles long ago. "Say thank you to Mr. Callahan for supper, Annie." "Thank you, Mr. Callahan." Annie picked up her spoon. "Your house was very dusty." "Annie," Clara said. "It was," Ethan said in a mild tone. "Less so now, though." Annie seemed satisfied by this. She ate her beans with tremendous enthusiasm and told the table at considerable length about a dog she'd known back in Cheyenne, and a boy at her old school who could whistle using his fingers, and a dream she'd had about a horse with a green tail. Luke ate quietly and watched his mother's face the way children watch a parent's face when they're still making the decision about whether a place is safe. Ethan watched Luke watching Clara and thought to himself, "This boy has been the man of this family for 2 years now, carrying that weight at 10 years old." He poured more beans into Luke's bowl without making any comment about it. Luke looked up, startled by this. Ethan just nodded toward the bowl. Luke ate. The first rumor reached them within 4 days' time. Ethan found out the way men in small towns always find out about things. Someone told someone who told someone whose wife mentioned it to the feed store owner, who managed to work it into a sentence when Ethan came in for oats. "Some folks are saying," said the feed store owner, a man named Horace with a talent for saying unpleasant things in a mild voice, "that your arrangement is irregular." "My arrangement?" Ethan said. "The widow living at your place, you know. She works at my place." "Just working?" Ethan looked directly at him. "What else would she be doing, Horace?" Horace managed to express considerable doubt without saying anything at all, which was a skill he'd mastered. Ethan paid for his oats and left the store. The second thing that occurred was the church. Ethan had never been what you'd call a regular churchgoer. Rose had been faithful, and after she died, he went twice a year because he felt it was respectful, and then came home and didn't feel any better for it. But when Clara and the children arrived, she asked him on that first Sunday if there was a church in town. "There is," he confirmed. "Do you attend?" "Sometimes." "Would it trouble you if we went?" "No." So they went. Pastor Elijah Brooks led services in the white clapboard church at the end of Main Street, a tall, serious man with kind eyes and the careful voice of someone who understood that words spoken in front of a congregation carry weight. He welcomed them without any drama, which Ethan appreciated. The congregation was less contained about it. Ethan could sense it from the first hymn. The way people angled their bodies without turning their heads fully. The whispered exchange behind a hand. The way Martha Greer, Walt's wife, looked at Clara and then looked away with a specific expression of someone storing information for later. After the service concluded, 2 women spoke warmly to Clara, and several didn't speak to her at all. And one woman, Ellen Mercer, wife of the town banker, looked at her with a smile so sharp it could have drawn blood. "Mrs. Whitmore," Ellen said, the name precise in her mouth like a thing to be handled carefully. "How kind of Mr. Callahan to employ you. He's been very generous," Clara responded evenly. "Indeed." Ellen's eyes moved to Ethan, then returned to Clara. "You must be quite capable to manage a ranch all on your own with 2 children. "I manage the house, ma'am. Mr. Callahan manages the ranch." "Of course." The smile didn't move from her face. "Of course, that's all it is." Ethan stepped forward. Not close, not aggressively, just enough to be present. "Mrs. Mercer," he said pleasantly, "your husband's still looking to buy the north pasture, I believe." Ellen blinked. "I'm sure I don't know Caleb's business." "Because my answer is still no," Ethan stated. "Just in case that comes up in conversation," he touched his hat brim, nodded, and walked with Clara and the children to the wagon. They drove the 6 miles home in the noon heat without speaking much at all. Annie had fallen asleep against Clara's arm. Luke was watching the road ahead. "She'll tell her husband," Clara said quietly. "She will," Ethan agreed. "Is that going to be a problem?" Ethan was quiet for a moment. The wagon rolled over a dry creek bed with a lurch, and Annie stirred and settled back against her mother without waking up. "Caleb Mercer's been wanting that north pasture for 2 years," Ethan said. "He wants the water rights that come with it. Without that land, his cattle operation doesn't expand the way he wants it to." He kept his eyes on the road ahead. "He's been waiting for me to need money bad enough to sell. And you don't?" "Not yet." Clara looked at him. "He'll use this. Whatever he thinks this is, he'll use it against you." "Probably so. And that doesn't worry you?" Ethan glanced at her sideways. "Worrying is something I do about things I can change, Mrs. Whitmore. Caleb Mercer's ambitions aren't one of them." She was quiet then. "You didn't have to do that back there with his wife." "No." "But you did?" She was being rude. Clara looked down at Annie sleeping in her lap. "People have been rude before. No one's ever—" She stopped, stepped in. She didn't finish the sentence, which was its own answer. Ethan turned his eyes back to the road. "You're working my land, honestly," he said. "You're raising your children right. Anybody has a problem with that? They've got a problem with me." He said it the way you say something that's already settled. No drama in it, just fact. Clara was quiet for the rest of the ride home. Caleb Mercer was a man who had learned early that power doesn't always look like power. He was 51, well-fed, with careful hands, and the patient eyes of someone who had made a profession of waiting. He ran the only bank in Red Hollow, and he knew, with the intimacy of a man who held everyone's notes, exactly how much everyone owed, and exactly where the pressure points were located. He came to see Ethan on a Tuesday morning, riding up the road to the ranch like a man making a social call, which it was not. Ethan was splitting firewood. He kept splitting it when he heard the horse approaching, finished the log he was working on, and then stopped and waited. Mercer dismounted. "Ethan." "Caleb." Mercer looked toward the house. "I heard you've taken on help." "You heard right. A widow, I understand." "That's correct." Mercer's voice stayed pleasant. "That's charitable of you, given the circumstances." "What circumstances would those be?" "A woman alone, no family, dependent on your generosity." Mercer let that sit for a moment. "People in town are concerned about appearances. People in town should concern themselves with their own affairs." "Ethan." The pleasantness thinned slightly. "I'm here as a friend, as someone who has always respected your family. Your wife was a good woman. This," he gestured toward the house, "doesn't honor her memory." Ethan set down his axe. He looked at Mercer for a long moment, long enough that Mercer almost said something to fill the silence and then thought better of it. "Rose," Ethan said, "would have had Clara and those children inside and fed before they finished introducing themselves." His voice was level. "Don't speak about her memory to me to make your business sound like principle." Mercer's expression didn't change, but something behind his eyes did. "The offer on the north pasture stands," he said. "Fair price. Help you through a difficult season. Season's fine. It will get harder." The words were said quietly, conversationally, but they were what they were. Ethan picked up his axe. "You need anything else, Caleb?" Mercer mounted his horse. He arranged his face back into pleasantness like a man putting on a coat. "Think about the offer," he said, "before things get complicated." He rode back down the road. Ethan split another log. Then he went inside and told Clara she should know that Mercer had been here and what he said and what he meant by it, because she had a right to know what she'd walked into. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she said, "Do you want us to leave?" "No." "If it gets worse for you?" "Mrs. Whitmore," he met her eyes directly. "I don't make decisions based on what Caleb Mercer might do. I made a decision when I offered you this work, and I stand by it. That's how I do things." Clara held his gaze for a moment. Then she nodded once and went back to what she'd been doing. Luke came home from town 12 days later with a split lip and mud on his knees. He walked into the yard, and Ethan saw him from the fence and came over without rushing, because rushing would embarrass the boy. "What happened?" Ethan asked. Luke's jaw was tight. "Nothing." "That's quite a nothing." Luke looked at the ground. "Some boys at the well. They said—" He stopped. "Things." "What things?" The boy's throat moved. "Called me a bastard ranch boy. Said my mama was." He didn't finish it. Ethan crouched down so he was at the boy's level. He looked at Luke's face. The cut lip, the dried blood, the expression of a 10-year-old boy trying very hard to be older than he was. "Did you fight back?" Ethan asked. "Yes, sir." "Good." Luke blinked, clearly not expecting that response. "Fighting back when someone insults your mother," Ethan said, "is not something I'll ever tell you was wrong." He looked at the boy steadily. "How many were there?" "3. You do any damage?" Something flickered at the corner of Luke's mouth. "Tommy Greer is going to have a black eye." "Walt's boy?" "Yes, sir." Ethan was quiet for a moment. Then he stood up. "Come inside. We'll clean that lip. Then you'll tell me exactly what was said." "Why does it matter what was said?" "Because," Ethan said, "I want to know what we're dealing with, and I'd rather know it from you than find out another way." Luke followed him inside. Clara saw her son's face, and her expression did something complicated and controlled. The face of a woman who had learned to manage her fear so her children didn't have to carry it. "It's all right," Luke said quickly. "I'm all right, Mama." She took his face in her hands anyway, turning it gently, checking the damage. "Sit down," she said. He sat. Ethan stood in the doorway and watched her tend to her son and felt something move through him, some old grief and some new thing that didn't have a name yet. And then he went back outside because a man needs somewhere to put the things he can't say. He stood at the fence for a long time looking at the mountains. Rose had loved this view. He thought, this house has been a grave for 3 years. And then he thought, it isn't anymore. And then he thought about Caleb Mercer and the boys at the well and the look on Martha Greer's face in church. And he understood, with the clarity of a man who has stopped pretending things will resolve on their own, that this was not going to get easier. He just hadn't decided yet what he was going to do about it. The sun was starting its long summer slide toward the mountains. Somewhere in the house behind him, he could hear Annie talking to the cat and Luke's voice answering something his mother asked, and then Clara's quiet laugh at whatever the response was, and the sound of a house that wasn't empty anymore came through the open window and settled around him like something he hadn't realized he'd been missing until just now. He straightened, picked up the fence post he'd set down, went back to work. The morning after Luke came home with a split lip, Ethan rode into Red Hollow alone. He didn't tell Clara where he was going. He didn't need to. She saw him saddle the roan before breakfast, and she watched him from the kitchen window with the expression of a woman who understood that certain things had to be handled by the person who intended to handle them. He found Walt Greer opening his store at 7 o'clock. "Your boy jumped mine at the well," Ethan said. He didn't raise his voice. 3 on 1. Walt straightened slowly. "Boys will be boys, Ethan. 3 on 1 isn't boys being boys, Walt. That's a lesson someone taught them." Walt's jaw tightened. "My Tommy said the Whitmore boy threw the first punch. After your Tommy called his mother a name I won't repeat in polite company." Ethan held the man's eyes. "You want to tell me that's acceptable in front of children?" Walt looked away first. "People are talking, Ethan. You can't blame them for having opinions." "I can blame them for putting those opinions in the mouths of children and sending them after a 10-year-old boy." Ethan set both hands flat on the counter. "It happens again. I won't be coming to talk." He bought his flour and left. Word got around the way words always got around in Red Hollow, fast and slightly wrong, which was worse than wrong entirely because it kept the shape of the truth while losing all its sense. By afternoon, the story had become that Ethan Callahan had threatened Walt Greer over a harmless schoolyard scuffle, which told Ethan everything he needed to know about who was controlling the narrative. Caleb Mercer had an office above the bank with a window that looked down on Main Street. Ethan had always suspected he spent a considerable portion of his day at that window, and events continued to confirm this suspicion. Clara heard the version of the story that arrived at the ranch from a woman named Ida Perkins, the nearest neighbor, who drove up the road that afternoon with a jar of preserves and the barely concealed purpose of gathering information. Ida was 60, loud, and fundamentally decent despite herself, which meant she told Clara the rumor while also clearly disapproving of it. "They're saying Ethan made threats," Ida said, setting the preserves on the kitchen table and looking around with the focused interest of someone cataloging everything they saw for later discussion over nothing. "It wasn't nothing," Clara said. She poured coffee without being asked. "3 boys jumped my son because of gossip. Adults started—" Ida's mouth thinned. She picked up her coffee. "You know how this town works, honey. I'm starting to. Mercer's been wanting that land for years. He's not a patient man." Ida lowered her voice like the walls might be listening. "He got the Hendersons out 2 years ago, called in their note when their harvest came up short. Land went to auction. He bought it for half what it was worth." Clara was quiet. "I'm just telling you," Ida said, "so you understand what you're up against." "I appreciate that, Mrs. Perkins." Ida finished her coffee, looked around the kitchen once more at the clean windows, the herb cuttings in a jar by the sink, the evidence of a house that had been cared for, and something softened briefly in her expression. "You've done good work here," she said gruffly. "Place hasn't looked like this since Rose was alive." She picked up her basket. "That's just an observation, not a judgment." She left without waiting for a response. Clara told Ethan about the Henderson land that night after the children were asleep. They sat at the kitchen table with the lamp between them and the window open to the heat, and she laid out what Ida had said in clear, careful sentences because she was a woman who dealt with information directly. Ethan listened without interrupting. "You knew about the Hendersons," she said when she finished. "I knew, and you know he'll try the same thing with you. He doesn't hold my note. I paid the ranch off 4 years ago." Clara's eyes moved across his face. "Then what does he have to use?" Ethan was quiet for a moment. "In Wyoming territory, a man can petition the county to have a property declared a public nuisance if he can show the owner's conduct is endangering community welfare." He said it flatly, without drama. "It's rare, but Mercer has a judge in Casper who owes him, and if he can get enough of the town to sign a complaint, he can take your land through the law. He can make it very difficult for me to keep it." Clara looked down at the table. The lamp flame moved slightly in the cross breeze, and the shadows shifted around them. "Ethan, if we're the cause of this, you're not the cause. Mercer's greed is the cause. You're just the excuse. That's a distinction that won't matter if you lose this ranch." "I'm not going to lose this ranch." She looked up at him. "How can you be sure?" He held her gaze. "Because I haven't done anything wrong, and I intend to make that very clear." It was the steadiest thing she had heard anyone say in 2 years. She didn't know whether to find it comforting or frightening. She found it both. Annie got sick the 2nd week of August. Not seriously, a summer fever, the kind that burns high for 2 days and then breaks and leaves a child limp and demanding soup and extra attention. But it shook Clara in a way she didn't show the children. A sick child with no doctor and no money in a hostile town was a particular kind of terror, and Clara had lived that terror before when Luke got croup 2 winters ago in a rooming house in Cheyenne with no one to help her. She sat up both nights. On the 2nd night, around 2 o'clock in the morning, Ethan appeared in the doorway of the small room where Annie slept. He was still dressed. Clara wasn't sure he'd been to bed at all. "Fever break?" he asked quietly. "Not yet." He nodded. He crossed the room, crouched beside the small bed, and put the back of his hand to Annie's forehead with a practiced gentleness that surprised her. "My daughter ran fevers like this," he said. Clara went very still. Ethan didn't look up from Annie's face. "She died at 3. Before Rose. That was—" He stopped. "That was a harder winter." The room was quiet, the kind of quiet that isn't empty but full. "I'm sorry," Clara said softly. "I didn't know. Nobody here does. I don't talk about it." He was quiet for a moment. Her name was Grace. Annie stirred in the bed, turned toward the sound of voices, and her eyes opened halfway, fever bright and unfocused. "Is it morning?" she murmured. "Not yet, sweetheart," Clara said. Annie's eyes found Ethan in the dim light. "Mr. Callahan." "Right here?" he said. Button came to sleep on the bed. She said with the logic of a feverish 6-year-old, "I told her you wouldn't mind." "I don't mind." She closed her eyes again. Ethan straightened. He and Clara looked at each other across the small room, over the sleeping child, and something moved between them that was too complicated to speak, and neither of them tried. "I'll get more water," he said. He was gone before she could say thank you. The fever broke by morning. Annie ate breakfast with the ferocious appetite of a child who had been sick and was now deeply committed to recovering, and demanded to go see the chickens, and the ordinary rhythm of the house closed back over the night before like water over a stone. But Clara carried what Ethan had said. She turned it carefully in her mind, the way you turn something fragile, a daughter named Grace, a harder winter, the particular way he had said it, with no self-pity, just fact, because that was how he handled everything, as fact, as something to be acknowledged and then continued through. She thought, this man has been carrying a great deal alone. She thought, so have I. She went back to work. The notice arrived on a Thursday. It came via the county marshal's deputy, a young man named Croft, who had the uncomfortable look of someone delivering a message he had not read but suspected was trouble. He handed it to Ethan at the gate and rode away quickly, which told Ethan something about the message before he opened it. It was a formal complaint signed by 11 residents of Red Hollow, requesting a town hearing on the grounds that Ethan Callahan's domestic arrangements constituted a public moral nuisance and set a damaging example for the community's children. The hearing was set for 2 weeks out. Caleb Mercer's name was not on the document, which meant his fingerprints were all over it. Ethan read it twice. Then he folded it and put it in his pocket and finished the fence post he'd been working on, because the fence needed doing and panic was a luxury he didn't have. Clara found him at the fence an hour later. She'd seen Croft arrive and leave. What was it? He handed her the folded paper without speaking. She read it. He watched her face, the way it went still, then careful, then something that wasn't quite fear but was close to it. 11 people? She said. Mercer had help. Ethan. She handed it back. This is about you. This has nothing to do with me or the children anymore. This is him coming for your land. I know. You should talk to a lawyer. Nearest lawyer is 40 miles. Then ride 40 miles. He almost smiled. You're not what I expected, Mrs. Whitmore. What did you expect? Someone more, he considered. Resigned. I was resigned, she said, for about a year after my husband died. It didn't help anything. She met his eyes. You didn't back down for Mercer when he came to the ranch. Don't start backing down now. He looked at her for a moment. I'll ride tomorrow, he said. He rode 41 miles to a lawyer named Gerald Fitch, who operated out of a cluttered office above a hardware store in Casper and who had a reputation for being effective, expensive, and honest, which was a difficult combination to maintain, and explained why he was only moderately prosperous. Fitch read the complaint. He read it again. He set it down and looked at Ethan over his glasses. Who signed this? Ethan named them. Fitch recognized 3 names and raised an eyebrow, and Caleb Mercer's name isn't on it. No, but he organized it. I'd stake the ranch on it. Fitch leaned back. The public nuisance statute they're invoking is legitimate but thin. They'd need to demonstrate actual harm to the community, not just moral disapproval, and that's a harder argument than it sounds. He tapped the paper. But if Mercer gets a sympathetic judge, he has one in Casper. Fitch was quiet for a moment. Judge Hartley? I don't know the name. If it's Hartley, this gets harder. Fitch looked at him steadily. You understand what you're dealing with here? This isn't about the widow. I know what it's about. Do you want my honest counsel? That's why I rode 40 miles. Fitch folded his hands on the desk. Simplest resolution. Remove the cause of complaint. Send the woman and her children on. Mercer loses his angle. Hearing goes away. Land stays safe. Ethan looked at him. That, Ethan said, is not a resolution I'm willing to consider. Fitch studied him for a long moment. Then he nodded slowly, with the expression of a man who had decided to respect something even if it cost him some effort. Then we fight it. And you need to understand it will be expensive, and it will be unpleasant, and there is no guarantee of the outcome. I understand. Why? Fitch asked. Not as a challenge, as a genuine question. A widow you met 6 weeks ago. Why is this land worth risking for her? Ethan was quiet for a moment. It isn't about her, he said. It's about the fact that I haven't done anything wrong, and I'll be damned if I let Caleb Mercer use the law to teach me that doing right has a price I shouldn't have paid. Fitch was quiet. Then he opened his desk drawer and took out a clean sheet of paper. All right, he said. Tell me everything from the beginning. Ethan arrived back at the ranch 2 days later in the early evening to find Pastor Elijah Brooks sitting at his kitchen table drinking coffee with Clara, which was not what he'd expected. Brooks stood when Ethan came in. He was a tall man with a direct manner and the particular dignity of someone who had decided at some point that he would rather be honest than comfortable. Ethan, he said, I came to talk to you. Clearly. Ethan set his hat on the hook. About the hearing, about what I intend to say at the hearing. Brooks set down his cup. I was told by 3 separate members of my congregation that I should make a public statement condemning your household, that failing to do so would be seen as condoning sin. The kitchen was very quiet. And, Ethan said, and I told them I would not do that. Brooks held his eyes. I have watched you these past weeks, Ethan. I have watched how these children are cared for, how this woman works. There is no sin in your household that I can identify, and I am not willing to perform a condemnation for the convenience of men with financial interests in the outcome. Clara's hands had stilled on the table. They'll pressure you, Ethan said. They already have. Brooks picked up his hat from the table. I wanted you to know where I stand before the hearing, so you don't walk in there thinking you're alone. He nodded to Clara, nodded to Ethan, and let himself out. The kitchen stayed quiet for a moment. Then Luke appeared in the doorway from the back hall. He'd clearly been listening. He looked at Ethan with those 2 old eyes. Is it going to be bad? He asked. Ethan looked at the boy. He thought about lying, which would have been kind. He thought about minimizing, which would have been practical. He said, it's going to be loud and ugly, and people are going to say things that aren't true, but we're going to stand there and let them say it, and then we're going to tell the truth, and the truth is going to hold. Luke held his gaze. How do you know? Because I've seen both sides of it, Ethan said, and the truth holds longer. Luke didn't look entirely convinced, but he nodded, and he didn't ask again. The 2 weeks before the hearing moved the way bad weather moves. Slow enough that you see it coming, fast enough that it hits before you're ready. The first thing Ethan noticed was the store credit. He'd had an account at Walt Greer's General Store for 11 years, paid on time every month without exception. When he went in the Monday before the hearing to pick up supplies, Walt told him, without meeting his eyes, that the account had been suspended pending review of his outstanding balance. Ethan's outstanding balance was $4.30. Is that so? Ethan said. Store policy, Walt said. Walt, I've had that account since before your youngest was born. Walt kept his eyes on the counter. I'm sorry, Ethan. It's just policy. Ethan counted out $4.30 from his pocket, set it on the counter, coin by coin, picked up his supplies, and left without another word. He went to the feed store next. Horace told him with slightly more discomfort than Walt, but the same result, that he couldn't extend credit this month. The hardware store was closed, which may have been coincidence and may not have been. The woman who usually sold eggs to the ranch sent word she had none to spare. In 4 hours, Ethan Callahan had been quietly, efficiently cut off from the commerce of a town he'd lived in for 15 years. He rode home and did the arithmetic in his head. He had enough stored supplies for 3, maybe 4 weeks. The ranch was producing its own eggs now. Clara had seen to that. The kitchen garden was yielding. They weren't going to starve, But Mercer was making the point anyway. Points don't have to be practical to land. Clara was at the table when he got home, writing a letter. She looked up at his face and read it with the speed of a woman who had learned to read trouble early. What happened? He told her about the stores. She set her pen down. She was quiet for a moment, and he watched something move through her. Not panic, not despair, but the hard, quiet anger of a woman who has watched people punish innocents before and has run out of patience for it. Mercer, she said. Has to be. Nobody does this all at once by coincidence. He's trying to make you feel it before the hearing, trying to make you come to him. I know. Will you? No. She looked at him. Ethan, you could lose. I know what I could lose. He said it gently but with finality. I also know what I'd lose if I let him win this way. And that loss is bigger. Clara was quiet. Then she picked up her pen. I'm writing to my sister-in-law in Laramie, my husband's brother's wife. She's practical, and she has connections with some of the women's aid societies. I don't know if it'll matter, but it might. Ethan sat down across from her. Write the letter. She wrote it. He watched her hands move across the page, steady, precise, not a wasted word, and thought that there was a kind of courage in the practical, the courage of people who don't stop moving just because the ground is uncertain. Luke overheard them talking and said nothing about it. But the next morning he was up before dawn and had finished the chicken feeding, the water hauling, and half the wood splitting before Ethan came out of the house. He stood back when Ethan appeared, not quite looking at him in the way of a boy who wants to offer something but doesn't know if it will be received. Ethan looked at the split wood, looked at Luke. Good work, he said simply. Luke's shoulders dropped half an inch, the relief of a child who needed to be useful and got to be. They worked the rest of the morning without talking much, which was by then their natural mode, the comfortable silence of two people who understood each other without requiring constant confirmation. At noon, Luke said, without looking up from the fence rail he was sanding, are they going to take the ranch? They're going to try. What happens if they do? They won't. But if they did? Ethan stopped working. He turned to face the boy fully. Luke, look at me. Luke looked up. If the worst happened, which it won't, you and your mother and your sister would not be left without a place or plan. I want you to understand that. Whatever happens at that hearing, I have made arrangements. Luke held his eyes. What kind of arrangements? The kind that mean you're not alone in this. Ethan held the boy's gaze. That's all you need to know right now. Luke was quiet for a long moment. Something in his face, that old worn expression, shifted slightly. Okay, he said. He went back to sanding. The night before the hearing, Annie climbed into the kitchen while Clara was baking and sat on the floor next to the stove, which was her preferred location for serious conversations, and said, Mama, why do people not like us? Clara set down her spoon. She sat on the floor next to her daughter, which was the kind of mother she was. She met Annie where Annie was, not where it was convenient. Some people, she said carefully, don't like things they don't understand, and we're something new here, something they didn't expect. Annie thought about this. Do they not like Mr. Callahan either? Some of them. Right now, yes. That's stupid, Annie said with the devastating simplicity of 6. Mr. Callahan fixed our wheel, and he lets Button sleep inside, and he didn't yell at Luke even when Luke broke the good bucket. I know, sweetheart. If people knew those things, they would like him. Clara smoothed her daughter's hair. You're right, they would. Annie leaned against her. Will it be okay tomorrow? Clara didn't lie to her children. She'd decided that 2 years ago when their father died, and she'd had to tell them the truth before she was ready to say it, and she'd seen how the truth, even hard truth, settled them more than false comfort did. I don't know, she said, but we'll be together, and Ethan will be there, and that's more than we had 6 weeks ago. Annie considered this. That's true, she said, as though it had been a reasonably good argument. She stood up. Can I have some of the batter? Clara handed her the spoon. The town hall of Red Hollow sat between the church and the land office, a plain, functional building that held community meetings, occasional dances, and the particular kind of civic theater that small towns perform when they need to feel institutional. On the morning of the hearing, it was fuller than Ethan had ever seen it. He arrived with Clara on his left and the two children behind them and walked through the door of that building like a man who had every right to be there, which he did, and intended everyone present to understand that. The room went quiet when they entered. Not the comfortable quiet of respect, the loaded quiet of an audience that has been waiting. Caleb Mercer sat at the front table alongside two county representatives Ethan didn't recognize, and a third man, older, heavy, with the settled authority of a judge, who Ethan recognized immediately as the man Fitch had warned him about, Judge Hartley. Mercer's judge. Ethan's jaw tightened slightly. He kept walking. Fitch was already there at a side table with papers in front of him and the contained expression of a man who had assessed the room and was recalculating. He caught Ethan's eye. The recalculation was not encouraging. Pastor Brooks was seated in the third row. He nodded once at Ethan with the quiet solidarity of a man who had said what he meant and meant what he said. Ethan sat down. Clara sat beside him, straight-backed, her hands folded in her lap, her face arranged into the composed expression of a woman who would not give this room the satisfaction of seeing her frightened. Luke sat on her other side. Annie pressed small and watchful against his arm. Mercer didn't look at them. That was its own statement. Mercer's man opened the proceedings. He was a lawyer from Casper named Aldous Pierce, smooth and precise, who laid out the complaint in careful, measured language designed to sound reasonable while meaning something cruel. He talked about community standards. He talked about the responsibility of property owners to the moral character of their neighbors. He talked about the children of Red Hollow and the examples set for them. He did not once say, Caleb Mercer wants this man's land and has manufactured a moral panic to get it. When Pierce finished, Fitch rose. He was quieter than Pierce, less polished. He had the manner of a man who had seen enough courtrooms to know that performance was less reliable than precision. He laid out three things: that Ethan Callahan's employment of Clara Whitmore was a legitimate labor arrangement, that no evidence of impropriety existed beyond rumor, and that the statute being invoked had never in Wyoming territory been successfully applied to a case without documented harm. He said it all plainly. He sat down. Judge Hartley looked at Mercer's table and back at Fitch and Ethan with the expression of a man who had already decided and was performing the decision-making for the record. "We'll hear from witnesses," he said. The witnesses Mercer had assembled were a particular kind of theater. Walt Greer spoke about community character. Ellen Mercer spoke about her concern for the moral education of Red Hollow's youth. A farmer named Peters, whose land bordered Ethan's south pasture, said he'd seen things that made him uncomfortable, and when pressed by Fitch to specify, could not specify anything that was not entirely ordinary domestic activity. Each of them spoke with the self-righteous discomfort of people who knew they were doing something they would not want examined too closely but had convinced themselves the cause justified it. Ethan sat still through all of it. Clara sat still. The children sat still. And the room watched them. And some faces held satisfaction, and some faces held discomfort. And a few faces in the back, Ida Perkins was one, held something that looked a great deal like shame. Then Hartley said, "Does the respondent wish to speak?" Ethan stood. The room shifted. He didn't look at Mercer. He looked at the room, at the people gathered, the faces, the neighbors he'd known for 15 years, and the strangers, and the few friends, and the many watchers. 3 years ago, he said, my wife died, and my house went quiet, and I worked this land alone, and did not ask this town for anything, and this town asked nothing of me. His voice was level. 6 weeks ago, a woman came to Red Hollow with 2 children and nothing else. She asked for work. Nobody offered her any. I did. He paused. She cooks. She cleans. She tends the garden my wife planted and couldn't finish. She's teaching my chickens to be productive, which is more than I managed. Her son works harder than men twice his age. Her daughter, a brief pause, named my barn cat. A sound moved through the room. Not quite laughter, Something more complicated. I have done nothing wrong, Ethan said. I offered honest work to an honest woman who needed it. I will not apologize for that. I will not be made to feel ashamed of it, and I will not send them away to satisfy a man who wants my north pasture and has spent 6 weeks trying to find a moral argument for taking it. Silence. Complete, ringing silence. And then Caleb Mercer, who had not spoken once through the entire proceeding, stood up. That is a slanderous accusation, Mercer said. His voice was controlled, but just barely, made without evidence. You came to my ranch, Ethan said, still level, 3 days after Mrs. Whitmore arrived. You told me the offer on the north pasture stood. You told me things would get complicated. 1 week later, my store credit was suspended. 2 weeks later, this complaint appeared with 11 names on it. He looked at Mercer directly. I don't need a lawyer to connect those facts, Caleb, and neither does anyone in this room. The silence was different now, heavier. The kind of silence that happens when a truth is said in a room full of people who have been pretending not to know it. Mercer's face went red. Judge Hartley, Mr. Callahan, Hartley said sharply, you will not make accusations in this hearing without documentation. I have documentation. Fitch rose. He placed a paper on the judge's table, bank records obtained legally, showing a $5,000 payment from Mercer's account to a county official in Casper, specifically to the clerk responsible for the assignment of this hearing to your court, Judge Hartley. The room erupted. Mercer was on his feet. Pierce was on his feet. Hartley slammed his hand on the table for order and got none for a full 30 seconds. Ethan stood in the middle of it, not moving, with the stillness of a man who has placed his card and is waiting to see what the table does. Clara's hand found his arm, not clinging, just present. A brief, real contact. He didn't look down, but his posture changed just slightly, like a man who has been carrying something alone and just felt someone take a corner of the weight. When the room quieted, Fitch said, we request the dismissal of this complaint and the recusal of Judge Hartley on the grounds of documented conflict of interest. Hartley's face was the color of old brick. This is not the appropriate venue. It is the only venue available to my client today. Fitch was very calm. If you wish to contest the documentation, I invite the court to do so formally. The records are already in the hands of a second attorney in Cheyenne. He paused. And a reporter from the Wyoming Tribune. The second eruption was louder than the first. It took another 40 minutes for the hearing to dissolve into chaos, and then into the uncomfortable administrative business of formal dismissal, which Hartley performed with the graceless haste of a man trying to exit a room before the fire reaches him. Mercer walked out without looking at Ethan. Pierce gathered his papers with the practiced neutrality of a lawyer who had been on the losing side before and would recover. The 11 signatories filed out with varying degrees of discomfort, some avoiding Ethan's eyes. One woman, Mary Hutchkins, actually stopped and opened her mouth as if to say something, and then closed it again and moved on. Ida Perkins stopped. You handled that well, she said gruffly to both of them. Fitch handled it, Ethan said. Fitch had the paper. You had the room. She looked at Clara. Your letter reached someone. Honey, that's where the Tribune man came from. Clara blinked. My sister-in-law? Apparently, she knows a woman who knows someone at the paper. Ida shrugged. Good thing, too. She patted Clara's arm once, firmly, and walked out. They were among the last to leave. Luke had been silent through the whole proceeding. Silent with the focused, absorbing attention of a boy storing everything away for later examination. As they walked out into the August heat and the street of Red Hollow, he walked close to Ethan's side, not touching, just close. Ethan glanced down at him. You okay? He asked. Yes, sir. Luke thought for a moment. Mr. Callahan? Yeah? You knew about the bank records before you went in there. It was not a question. Fitch found them, Ethan said. But you let Mercer talk. You let all of them talk. You waited until he stood up. Luke's eyes were sharp. Why? Ethan looked at the boy for a long moment. Because the room needed to hear what he was before they saw what he'd done, he said. People can dismiss evidence. They find it harder to dismiss the man they just watched stand up. Luke was quiet, processing. That's smart, he said finally. Fitch is smart, Ethan said. I just trusted him. Annie, who had been holding her mother's hand and listening to none of this because she had spotted a dog outside the feed store, tugged free and ran toward it. And Clara called after her, and for a moment it was just ordinary. The unremarkable, irreplaceable ordinary of a family on a summer street. Ethan stopped walking. He stood in the street of Red Hollow in the August heat and looked at those three people. The woman calling her daughter's name with exasperated love. The boy beside him with his two old eyes gone slightly soft. The small girl crouched happily in the dirt, making friends with a stranger's dog. And he felt something shift in his chest. Not settled, not over. Mercer wasn't done, and the town wasn't healed, and there was still a long road ahead. He knew that. But something had broken open today that couldn't be closed again. In the hearing room, in the town's understanding of what had been done and who had done it, and in him, in the part of him that had been a grave for 3 years and had been slowly, and without his full permission, becoming something else. Clara came back with Annie in tow and looked at his face. What is it? She asked quietly. Nothing, he said. Then we should get home. She looked at him a moment longer. She nodded. They walked to the wagon together, and behind them, through the open windows of the town hall, the voices of Red Hollow continued. Confused, recalibrating, beginning the slow and uncomfortable work of deciding what kind of town they wanted to be. Caleb Mercer did not leave Red Hollow. Ethan had half expected it, that the exposure at the hearing, the documents, the Tribune reporter, the public unraveling of 6 weeks of careful maneuvering would be enough humiliation to drive a man to cut his losses and redirect his ambitions elsewhere. He'd seen men do it before, swallow the defeat, recalculate, find a softer target. Mercer was not that kind of man. He was the other kind. The kind whose pride is so tangled up in winning that losing becomes something personal, something that requires a response regardless of cost. Ethan understood this about him within 4 days of the hearing, because 4 days after the hearing, his water was cut. Not the creek. Nobody owned the creek, but the irrigation channel that ran from the creek to the kitchen garden and the stock trough had been dug 3 years ago across a narrow strip of land that technically belonged to a rancher named Cole Dunar, who had always been neighborly about it, who had shaken Ethan's hand every autumn at the harvest social for a decade. Cole Dunar had apparently reconsidered his neighborliness. He sent a written notice. Formal, stiff, clearly not written by Cole, who had never in his life used the phrase pursuant to land use statutes, informing Ethan that the irrigation channel constituted an unauthorized easement and must be blocked within 10 days. Ethan read it, folded it, set it next to Fitch's first letter on the kitchen shelf where he kept the documents of this particular season. Mercer got to Cole. He told Clara that evening. His note? She asked. Has to be. He sat down. Cole's been struggling since his wife got sick last spring. Medical bills. Mercer holds his paper. Clara's face was still. He's squeezing everyone around you. Tightening the circle. Ethan looked at his hands on the table. He can't come at the ranch directly anymore. Not after the hearing. So he comes at everything around it. What do we do about the water? I dig a new channel, longer route, stays entirely on my land. It'll take a week, and it'll be hard work. He looked up. Luke's going to want to help. Luke is 10. Luke is 10 and has been quietly treating himself as a grown man for 2 years. Telling him he can't help will be worse than letting him. He held her eyes. Your call. But that's my read. Clara was quiet for a moment. Let him help, she said. But you watch him. Always. They dug for 6 days. Ethan, Luke, and a hired hand named Sully, who was 63 years old and had the arms of a man half his age, and the opinion that Caleb Mercer was, and he used the exact word, a scoundrel. Sully had not been involved in the hearing, had not signed any complaint, and had shown up at the ranch gate the morning after the water notice with a shovel over his shoulder and no explanation beyond. Heard you got digging done. Ethan paid him fair. Sully said the digging was payment enough, which told Ethan something about what the hearing had done to the town's internal weather, even if the external weather was still cold. Luke dug without complaint, without drama, with the focused energy of a boy who needed to put his body to work because his mind was carrying more than a 10-year-old should carry. On the third day, when they broke for water and Sully wandered off to eat his lunch in his preferred solitary manner, Luke sat down next to Ethan in the dry grass and said without preamble, "I want to stay here." Ethan looked at him. Luke picked up a stone, turned it in his fingers. "I know we work for you. I know that's what it is. But I want—" He stopped. "I want this to be where we live, not just for now." The words landed with the particular weight of something a child has been practicing saying. Ethan was quiet for a long moment. The creek moved 30 feet away, and the summer heat pressed down on everything. "That's not entirely my decision," he said finally. "I know." Luke looked at the stone. "I'd have to ask Mama, but I'm asking you first because if you don't want us to stay, then there's no point asking her." Ethan looked at this boy. 10 years old, fatherless 2 years, carrying quiet responsibility like a man twice his size, and felt the truth of the moment press against his chest. "I want you to stay," he said. Luke looked up. "All of you," Ethan said. "That's been true for a while. I just hadn't said it." Luke was quiet. He turned the stone over once more. Then he set it down carefully, like he was placing something. "Okay," he said. He picked up his shovel and went back to work. The channel was finished on a Saturday. The water ran through it clean and strong, entirely on Callahan land. And when Annie saw it working, she clapped her hands like they'd performed a miracle, which in the circumstances was not entirely wrong. That night, Sully stayed for supper, and it was the fullest the kitchen table had been. And Annie told Sully at length about Button the cat and the chickens and the horse she had been promised she could ride when she was a little bigger, which promise Ethan had no memory of making but did not dispute. Sully ate 2 plates and said it was the best meal he'd had since 1869, which was probably an exaggeration but felt true in the way that matters. When he left, he stopped at the door and looked back at the table, the lamp, the dishes, the family arranged around it, with an expression that had something old and private in it. "Good house," he said simply. He meant it as more than the building. Everyone understood that. The barn burned on a Tuesday. Not the house, the barn, and not by accident. Ethan smelled the smoke before he saw the light. He was asleep, and then he wasn't, because the smell hit him, and his body knew what it was before his mind caught up, and he was out of bed, and through the door, and across the yard in the dark, before he had fully put together the thought, fire. The barn was well involved by the time he got there. The horses were screaming. He went in anyway. He got 2 horses out, then a third. The fourth was in the back stall, panicked beyond moving, and he grabbed its halter and pulled and talked low and rough in the way you talk to a frightened animal. And the horse came, finally, violently, nearly knocking him down, and they came out of the barn together into the hot, dark air, and the horse ran, and Ethan turned around. Luke was standing at the barn door. He had gotten there before Ethan saw him, and he'd brought the horses at the near end out by himself, 2 of them in the dark, on fire. At 10 years old, he was standing with a burn on his left forearm and a wild, focused look in his eyes. "I got Molly and the roan," he said. His voice was shaking, but his body was not. Ethan grabbed the boy's shoulders. "You go back in the house. You hear me? Right now." "But the—" "Now, Luke." Luke went. He went without argument, which meant he understood the command was not negotiable. Ethan turned back. The barn was past saving. He could see that. But the tool shed was connected at the south corner, and if the fire reached it, it reached the house wall 20 feet beyond, and that was not going to happen. He worked for 2 hours. Sully appeared from somewhere, because Sully apparently had the instincts of a man who has lived long enough to know when to show up. Together they kept the fire from the shed. The barn burned down to its bones, and then to ash, and the Wyoming night went quiet again, and Ethan stood in the yard covered in smoke and ash and looked at what was left. Clara was behind him. She'd been there for the last hour, hauling water with the grim efficiency of a woman who does not panic, staying back because he'd told her to, doing what she could from the perimeter. She stood beside him and looked at the ruin. "The horses?" she asked. "All out. Luke got 2 before I got there." She made a sound. Not quite a word. The sound of a mother who has just fully processed what her son did. "His arm," Ethan said. "I dressed it. It's not deep." They stood there. The ash settled. The first gray of pre-dawn was beginning at the edge of the sky. "Mercer," Clara said. "Or someone Mercer paid." Ethan's voice was very quiet and very even. "There will be tracks. I'll find them in the daylight, and then I'll know." Clara turned to look at him. His face in the pre-dawn was ash-streaked and exhausted, and absolutely set in the way of a man who has moved past anger into something colder and more resolute. "Ethan." She said his name with the particular weight of someone who wants to make sure they're heard. "Whatever you're thinking right now, you don't do it alone." He looked at her. "You don't ride out alone," she said. "You don't confront him alone. Whatever comes next, you don't carry it alone. Not anymore." He held her eyes. "Not anymore," she said again, quieter. It was the most direct thing she had said to him in 2 months. He understood every layer of it. "I won't," he said. She nodded once. She went back inside. He stood in the yard until it was light enough to track. The tracks led to the South Road and to a pair of boots that matched a man named Denny Voigt, who did odd work for Mercer and had the look of a man who had never once asked what something was for before agreeing to do it. Ethan found the boots in the bunkhouse behind Mercer's property, which was either brazen stupidity or the action of a man who was entirely sure he was untouchable. He took the tracks to Marshall Croft. Croft was young and uncomfortable and clearly aware that arresting a man connected to Caleb Mercer had implications for his continued employment in Red Hollow. He looked at the evidence Ethan laid out with the expression of a man calculating very fast. "This implicates Mercer," Croft said. "It implicates Voigt. What it says about Mercer is a separate question, Ethan. A man burned my barn. There were horses inside. My boy went in after them and has a burn on his arm to show for it." Ethan's voice did not rise. "I am not asking you to do anything except your job, Marshall." Croft looked at the evidence for a long moment. "Give me until tomorrow morning," he said. "You've got tonight." Croft arrested Denny Voigt before noon the next day. Voigt, who had the unfortunate quality of cracking under minimal pressure, gave Mercer's name inside of 2 hours. He didn't have documentation. It had been a cash arrangement and a verbal instruction, but he had enough specifics that Croft had no choice but to bring Mercer in for questioning. The news moved through Red Hollow in the way news moves through small towns that have been holding their breath. Fast, complete, and with a quality of release, like pressure dropping before weather changes. Ethan heard about the questioning from Fitch, who had been notified through the Cheyenne attorney, who had been notified through the Tribune reporter, who had apparently been keeping close watch on Red Hollow events since the hearing. The information network Clara had inadvertently set in motion with her letter to her sister-in-law had developed a life of its own. Ida Perkins drove up to the ranch that afternoon with a pie, a real pie, apple, still warm, and the expression of a woman who had something to say and was going to say it in the context of a peace offering. "I signed it," she said. She was standing in the kitchen, the pie on the table, not sitting down, because sitting down would have been comfortable, and she didn't feel she'd earned comfort yet. "The complaint. Back in July, she stopped, before I knew." Clara looked at her. "I should have known," Ida said. "I've lived here 30 years. I knew what Mercer was. I signed anyway because the other women were signing, and I was." She pressed her lips together. "I was a coward, and I'm sorry." The kitchen was quiet. Clara said, "Why are you telling me and not Ethan?" "Because you're the one I wronged more." Ida looked at her directly. "He's a man with land and standing. He had something to defend. You had nothing when you came here. Nothing but those children. And I signed a paper that said you were a problem." Her voice went rough. "That was wrong. I knew it was wrong, and I did it anyway. I'm sorry." Clara was quiet for a moment. Annie was in the yard, Luke was with the horses, the kitchen was just the two of them, and the warm smell of pie, and 30 years of a small town's accumulated cowardice sitting on the table between them. "Sit down, Mrs. Perkins," Clara said. Ida sat. Clara poured coffee. "You're not the only one who signed," Clara said. "And you're the only one who's come to say this. That matters." Ida wrapped her hands around the cup. "I talked to some of the others. Martha Greer is having a hard time looking at herself right now. I think you'll be seeing more people." She paused. "Not all of them. Some people don't come back from what they did. But some will." "I know," Clara said. "You're not angry." Clara looked at her across the table. "I've been angry for 2 months, Mrs. Perkins. I'm tired of the weight of it." She wrapped her own hands around her cup. "I'd rather use the energy on something else." Ida was quiet. Then, unexpectedly, her eyes went bright. She looked down at her coffee quickly. "You're a good woman," she said gruffly. "Rose would have liked you." Clara said nothing, but something in her face softened. Ethan found out about Ida's visit from Luke, who had come in for water and witnessed the end of it, and who reported it to Ethan in the barn with the precise brevity of someone transmitting intelligence. "Mrs. Perkins apologized," Luke said. "For real?" "I think so. Not the kind where you're apologizing but still think you're right." "How can you tell the difference?" Luke considered this seriously. She looked at the floor a lot. "People who aren't really sorry look at you so you can see they're being sorry." Ethan looked at the boy for a moment. "That's a very accurate observation. Mama cried after she left. A little. She didn't want me to see." Luke looked at Ethan steadily. "She's been carrying a lot. More than she shows. I know that too." Luke was quiet for a moment. Then, "Are you going to say something to her, or are you just going to know it and not say it?" The directness of the question, delivered without self-consciousness, the way only children can deliver the thing adults have been carefully not saying, landed somewhere between funny and devastating. Ethan looked at Luke. Luke looked back at him with calm patience. "I'll say something," Ethan said. "Good," said Luke, and he picked up his bucket and went back to the horses. He found her in the kitchen garden at dusk. She was pulling the last of the summer weeds from between the bean rows, the work she did at the end of hard days. The physical task her hands went to when her mind needed somewhere to put itself. He stopped at the edge of the garden. She'd heard him coming, but she didn't stop working. "Ida came," she said. "Luke told me." He paused. "The others may come too. Some of them. Maybe," he paused. "Clara." She stopped at the sound of her name in his voice. She turned to look at him. "Luke asked me 2 days ago if I wanted you to stay," he said. I told him yes. He held her eyes. "I should have told you instead." The garden was quiet. The last light of the day was doing what August light does in Wyoming, going gold and long and slightly unbearable in its beauty. Clara looked at him. Her hands were still, dirt on them, working hands. "I don't want to be an arrangement," she said carefully. "I've been grateful. I am grateful. But I don't want to be something you're obligated to because you did the right thing once and now the right thing won't let you go. That's not what this is. Then what is it?" He crossed the short distance between them. He stood close enough that she had to look up at him, and he looked at her with the same directness he used for everything. No performance, no careful words. Just the plain fact of what was true. "This house was empty for 3 years, he said, "and now it isn't. And that's because of you. Not because of your cooking or your work or what you do for the place, though all of it matters. Because of you." He paused. "I would like you to stay, not as a housekeeper, not as a worker, as—" He stopped. "As what?" she asked quietly. He looked at her. "As the person you already are here," he said. "If you want to be—" Clara was still for a long moment. Her hands, her face, the light. "I have 2 children," she said. "I know. I've met them." Something moved across her face. something that had been careful for a very long time, letting go of its carefulness. "The barn needs rebuilding," she said. "It does. That's a lot of work." "It is. You'll need help." "I will." She looked at him. The corner of her mouth moved. Not quite a smile, but close. The beginning of one. "Luke will want to help." "Luke already informed me he intends to," Ethan said. She laughed. It was the first full laugh he'd heard from her. Surprised out of her, real and warm. And it changed the whole quality of the evening. He smiled. He couldn't help it. Annie's voice came from the yard, calling for her mother with the inexorable persistence of 6. "Coming, Annie," Clara called. She looked back at Ethan one more time. Something settled between them. Not a beginning, exactly. More like an acknowledgement of something that had been true for a while and was now no longer pretending not to be. "I want to stay," she said. He nodded. Simple, like something decided. She walked past him toward the house, and Annie came running and crashed into her legs, and Clara caught her daughter with both arms and lifted her up, and Ethan watched them go inside together. He stood in the garden in the last of the light. Above him, the Wyoming sky was doing its impossible August thing, turning colors that had no names, and the mountains sat heavy and patient on the horizon, the way they'd always sat, the way they'd sat when Rose was alive and when she wasn't, and through the 3 empty years, and now through this. He thought, the barn needs rebuilding. He thought, I know how to build things. He turned and walked toward the house. Behind the kitchen window, the lamp came on. The barn rebuilt itself in pieces, the way most things worth having are built. Not all at once, not by one person, but by accumulation. Sully came the first morning with lumber in his wagon and 2 men Ethan didn't know, who turned out to be brothers from the east side of the county who had heard about the fire the way news travels in ranch country. Fast, word of mouth, arriving already attached to a judgment. The judgment was that arson was arson, and a man whose barn got burned deserved help from his neighbors. And these 2 brothers had decided that independent of any particular feeling about Ethan Callahan or the widow or Caleb Mercer or any of it, they showed up. They worked. They left at dark without expecting supper. They came back the next day. On the 3rd day, Cole Dunar appeared at the gate. Ethan saw him from the framing and came down from the half-built wall without hurrying. Cole stood at the gate holding his hat in both hands with the posture of a man doing penance, which was what he was doing. "Mercer called my note," Cole said. "Month ago. Told me he'd extend if I sent you the easement letter." He looked at the ground. "I knew what he was doing. I sent it anyway." Ethan looked at him. "I'm sorry," Cole said. "That's the whole of it. I'm sorry." "Mercer's in Cheyenne right now being questioned by the territory attorney," Ethan said. "Your note may be part of that. You should talk to Fitch." Cole looked up, startled. "The territory attorney?" The Tribune reporter did more digging after the hearing. "The Henderson land." "Your note. 2 other ranchers I didn't know about." Ethan's voice was level. "Mercer has been doing this for a long time, and to a lot of people, you weren't the first." Cole's jaw worked. "I should have come to you instead of." "Yes," Ethan said simply. "You should have." He looked at the man for a moment. "You want to make it right, Cole? You can pick up a hammer. We're short a man on the east wall." Cole looked at the barn, at the workers, at Ethan. "All right," he said quietly. He tied up his horse and went to find a hammer. Clara watched from the kitchen window as the barn went up day by day, and she kept track of the faces the way she kept track of everything, carefully, without sentimentality, noting what was real. Some faces were familiar. Sully, the brothers, Cole Dunar, a woman from the church who brought food 3 days running and never asked to come inside, just left it at the door, which was its own kind of apology. Some faces were new, people she hadn't met yet, who came because word had traveled, and because the story of what Mercer had done was spreading in the specific way that stories spread when they confirm what people suspected about a man who has too much power in a small place. Martha Greer came on a Wednesday. She was Walt's wife, the woman who had watched Clara in church with cataloging eyes, who had been among the first to whisper, and the last to reconsider. She came alone, without Walt, which told its own story. She brought a jar of preserves and stood at the kitchen door and said, "I owe you an apology." "Come in," Clara said. Martha came in. She sat. She looked at her hands. "I was afraid of you," she said, "when you first came. Not afraid of you specifically. Afraid of what it meant. A woman like you, capable, alone, asking nothing from anyone. It made me feel—" She stopped. "Small," Clara said quietly. Martha looked up. "It made you feel like the wrong kind of woman had shown up and was making everyone aware of what the wrong kind was," Clara said. "Not unkindly. Just true." Martha's eyes went bright. "That's a hard thing to hear said out loud." "I know. I've thought it about other women myself at different points in my life." Clara poured coffee. "We're not always kind to each other, especially when we're frightened." Martha sat with that. Then, "Walt's having a hard time. He knows what he did. He's not. Walt's not a bad man. He's a weak one. There's a difference." "There is. He wants to come apologize. He's not sure he'll be received." "He'll be received," Clara said. "When he's ready?" Martha looked at her with the look of a woman revising an opinion she'd held for months. "You're not what I expected. People keep saying that. What did you expect us to expect?" Clara looked at her steadily. "Nothing good," she said, "and you didn't disappoint for a while." Martha surprised them both by laughing. It was a short, startled sound, but it was real. The barn was finished on a Friday. Ethan drove the last nail in the top beam late in the afternoon with Luke beside him and Sully watching from below with the critical eye of a man who takes construction personally. When it was done, Sully walked around the whole structure twice, inspecting, and then said it would hold, and that the pitch on the east side was better than the original, which Ethan took as high praise. Annie declared the new barn superior to the old one on the grounds that it smelled better, which made Sully laugh for the first time since Ethan had known him. That night, Clara made a proper supper, a real one. Not the careful rationing of the past weeks, but the abundance of a woman cooking for people she wanted to feed. The table held Ethan, Clara, Luke, Annie, Sully, and Cole Dunar, who had been quietly working alongside them every day since he showed up at the gate, rebuilding the thing he'd helped damage, one nail at a time. It was loud. Annie held forth about the chickens, the cat, and a comprehensive plan she had developed for a second cat, which she called Cat 2 for efficiency. Sully argued with Cole about the proper angle for fence bracing. Luke talked more than he'd talked at any table Ethan could remember, the careful quiet of him finally giving way to something looser and younger. Ethan sat at the head of his table and said very little and watched all of it and felt in his chest the specific weight of a life being rebuilt. Not the same as it was, better in ways he hadn't anticipated, different in ways that still sometimes surprised him. After supper, after Sully and Cole had gone and the children were in bed, Clara washed and Ethan dried the way they had fallen into the habit of doing, and the kitchen was quiet with the easy quiet of people who have stopped performing comfort and just have it. Clara handed him a plate. "Mercer's lawyer came to see Fitch today." Ethan looked at her. "They want to settle," she said, quietly. "Drop everything. Voight takes a fine. Mercer pays damages for the barn and the Henderson land and the other 2 ranchers. No criminal charges." "What does Fitch say?" "He says it's your call. He says a quiet settlement means Mercer doesn't go to trial, means nothing in the record." She met his eyes. "Means he keeps the bank, keeps the land, keeps his standing here. Just diminished? What do you think?" She looked at the dish in her hands. "I think the people he hurt need the money. The Hendersons, Cole, the other. A settlement pays them." She looked up. "I also think you've been fighting this for 2 months, and you're tired, and your barn just got rebuilt, and your children—" She stopped herself. "My children," he said. She heard what he did with those 2 words. She looked at him. "My children," he said again, steadily, looking at her, meaning all of it. Luke and Annie, the boy who had dug his channel and pulled horses from fire, the girl who had named his cat and made his house loud again. Clara set down the dish. She turned to face him fully. "Ethan, I want to marry you," he said, plainly, without ceremony or preamble or the elaborate construction of a romantic declaration, just the fact said directly. The way he said everything that mattered. "I should have said it before. I'm saying it now. I want you to be my wife. I want Luke and Annie to have this ranch as theirs. I want us to stop being an arrangement and start being what we already are." The kitchen held very still. Clara looked at him for a long time. The lamp moved. The night outside was quiet. Somewhere in the house, Annie was talking in her sleep. That running low murmur of a child whose mind keeps working even in dreams. "You're not asking because of the town," Clara said, "or the hearing, or what people think. No, you're not asking because it makes things simpler legally. No. Why, then?" "Because I love you," he said, "and I've been slow about saying it. And Luke informed me with considerable directness that I was the kind of man who knows things and doesn't say them, and I'm trying to do better." Clara made a sound that was partly a laugh and partly something else entirely. She pressed her hand over her mouth for a moment, then she took it away. "Luke said that, word for word? He's been talking to you like that for about a month." She shook her head slowly. "He's going to be insufferable when he finds out it worked." "Probably." She looked at Ethan. Everything in her face was open. The carefulness she had worn for 2 years, the practiced composure, the managed distance, all of it set down. Just her. She said, "Yes, yes, I'll marry you." She held his eyes. "I love you too. I've been slow about saying it as well." He reached across and took her hand. That was all. Just her hand and his in the kitchen they had made a home of, in the house that had stopped being a grave. They told the children the next morning at breakfast. Annie received the news that Ethan was going to be her father with the equanimity of a child who had been working toward this conclusion for weeks and was gratified that the adults had finally caught up. She said, "Does that mean I can ride the bay?" And when Ethan said yes, she considered the whole matter satisfactorily resolved and went back to her eggs. Luke said nothing for a long moment. He looked at Ethan across the table with those steady, too old eyes, and then he looked at his mother, and then he looked back at Ethan. "You meant it," Luke said. "What you said in the barn, about wanting us to stay. I meant it. It wasn't just—" Luke searched for the word. "It wasn't just because it was the right thing." "No," Ethan said. "It was because I wanted it. Both things can be true. Usually the things that matter are both." Luke took that in. He nodded slowly with the deliberate nod of a 10-year-old who was filing something away to be certain of later. Then he said, "Can I learn to work the north pasture after the wedding?" Ethan looked at him. "You can start on the north pasture before the wedding." Luke smiled. Not the careful, almost smile he usually managed, but a full one, the kind that changed his whole face into something that looked his actual age. It was the best thing Ethan had seen in years. They married on a Sunday in September in the white clapboard church at the end of Main Street with Pastor Brooks presiding and a congregation that was larger than either of them expected. Not all of Red Hollow came. Some stayed away, men with pride too large to fit through a church door they'd spent months standing against. Ethan didn't fault them for it. Pride was a slow thing to move, but enough came. Ida Perkins sat in the second row and wore her good hat and cried openly from the first hymn, which she would have denied if anyone brought it up, and which no one did. Cole Dunar came with his wife. Walt Greer came alone, without Martha, and sat in the back. And when he caught Ethan's eye before the service, he nodded once, a small, plain nod, and Ethan nodded back, and that was its own version of enough. Sully sat in the front row on Ethan's side and cleaned his boots for the occasion and told anyone who would listen that he had seen this coming since the second day he worked at the ranch, which was almost certainly not true but sounded true, which, in Sully's philosophy of the world, was close enough. Luke stood beside Ethan as the ceremony started, straight-backed, serious-faced, the posture of a boy who understood the gravity of what was happening and had decided to be equal to it. At some point during Pastor Brooks's words, Luke's hand found Ethan's arm, not holding, but resting. The light, specific pressure of a child staking a claim. Ethan kept very still and did not look down because he knew if he looked down he would not be able to keep his face arranged appropriately. Annie stood beside her mother and held her flowers with tremendous concentration for approximately 2 minutes and then began examining a loose thread on her dress. And Clara reached down and took her daughter's hand without looking away from Ethan, and Annie submitted to this with a sigh and stood still. When Pastor Brooks asked if anyone present knew reason these two should not be joined, the church was absolutely silent. Ethan had not been certain it would be. It was. Clara looked at him across that silence with everything in her face that she had spent 2 years keeping composed and careful, and he looked at her with everything he had spent 3 years carrying alone. And the silence held all of it and was sufficient. "I do," said Ethan. "I do," said Clara. 3 weeks later, Caleb Mercer accepted the settlement terms Fitch had negotiated. He paid the Hendersons. He paid Cole. He paid 2 other ranchers whose names Ethan had learned through the process. Men Mercer had squeezed and leveraged and moved around like pieces on a board for years. He paid damages for the barn. He did not apologize. He did not leave Red Hollow. Men like Mercer don't leave. They contract. They recalculate. They find smaller ambitions in smaller corners. The bank stayed his. His standing stayed, though diminished the way Fitch had said, like a building still standing after a fire that has burned out everything inside it. Ethan didn't require an apology. He'd stopped requiring things of Mercer when he understood that a man whose power comes entirely from other people's fear is already living in a kind of ruin. He had other things to think about. October came into Wyoming the way it does. Fast, cold, with the first snow arriving earlier than expected and the mountains going white and the ranch going into the beautiful, serious business of preparing for winter. The new barn held its first full season of horses and was judged superior by everyone who worked in it. The kitchen garden had been put to bed properly for the first time in 3 years, mulched and covered, with Clara already planning what would go in differently in the spring. The irrigation channel ran clean along its new course through land that was theirs. One evening, when the first real cold had come, and the family had come inside from the early dark, and the lamp was lit and supper was on and the house was full of the noise of children and an old man who had taken to coming for dinner twice a week, because he had decided he was allowed to, Ethan sat at the head of his table and looked at all of it. Luke arguing with Sully about horses, Annie telling her mother something elaborate and urgent, Button the cat installed on the chair that had become definitively hers, Clara turning from the stove with a dish and catching Ethan's eye across the room and doing nothing with it except staying there, her eyes on his, just for a moment. Just the two of them inside all that good noise. He thought of Rose, the way he always thought of her, with love, with grief, with the particular ache of something that doesn't go away but changes shape. He thought of Grace, 3 years old, who had been buried in the spring of 1873, and after whom the house had gone quiet the first time, before the second quietness, before the long winter of just him and the work and the view she used to love. He thought, they are not replaced. Nothing replaces them. He thought, and the house is full. Both things true. Both things held. Annie's voice broke through. Papa, Sully says the bay is too young to ride, but I am also young, and I ride things. That's a solid argument, Ethan said. Sully looked outraged. It is not a solid. The bay will be ready in spring, Ethan said. You can both be ready in spring. Annie considered this. That's fair, she said, with the judicious tone of a 6-year-old who has been granted a small victory and knows how to hold it. Luke caught Ethan's eye across the table and did something he rarely did. He grinned, quick, unguarded, the grin of a boy who is, for the first time in a long time, not in charge of anything, not carrying anything, just at a table with his family. Being 10 years old, Ethan held that look for a moment. Then he looked at Clara, who had heard all of it, who was watching him with quiet, certain eyes. She said nothing. She didn't need to. Some things you don't say because there are no words sufficient and no words necessary, because the thing itself is already present and known and requires no translation. This was one of those things. Later, after the children were in bed and Sully had gone home and the kitchen was clean and the lamp was turned low, Ethan stood at the door to the porch and looked out at the Wyoming night, the mountains, the stars, the early season snow white on the ridgelines. Clara came and stood beside him. They stood there together, not speaking, the way people stand when they have come through something difficult and arrived somewhere real and are simply present in it. After a while, she said, Luke asked me today if we could get a dog. What did you tell him? I told him to ask you. Ethan was quiet for a moment. Spring, he said. When the barn work settles. That's what I thought you'd say. He looked at her sideways. You already told him spring, didn't you? I told him it was your decision, Clara said. Which it is. The corner of her mouth moved. I just had a feeling about what the decision would be. He shook his head slowly. She laughed quietly there in the dark, and the sound of it went out into the cold Wyoming night and was answered by nothing except the mountains, patient and enormous, holding their watch the way they always had and always would. Indifferent to the small, bright things that happened in their shadow, the fires and the hearings and the long silences and the words finally said, all of it, every moment of it mattering completely. A family had been built here, on this slope of land, out of loss and stubbornness and the specific courage of people who refused to stop, and it would hold